There's three levels of relationship to performance, right? And particularly to the performance of our story. Level one is pre-tragic performance. It's clear, we perform. We're in some version of pre-modern performance in our tradition. Gorgeous, right? It's fantastic. And then we get to this tragic place of postmodernity where we stop performing. And we actually view performance becomes a pejorative word. It becomes identical with the inauthentic, with the not real. And then we go to the post-tragic and we realize, no, we perform to elicit the real. So David, resonate a code, my friend. Give us a code, okay? Oh my God.
So here is the code. The universe is not a fact, or is not merely a fact. It is a story. Not an ordinary story, a love story. Not an ordinary love story, but an evolutionary love story. And your love story, my love story, is a chapter in the evolutionary love story. To know my life is a story is to know that the story must be performed. There are three levels of relationship to performance, and particularly to the performance of our story. Level one, pre-tragic performance. Level two is when we meet the tragic and stop performing. Level three is the post-tragic, in which we reclaim both the dignity and divinity of our performance. So this week's Evolutionary Love Code: the universe is not merely a fact, it is a story. Not an ordinary story, a love story. Not an ordinary love story, but an evolutionary love story. And your love story is a chapter in the evolutionary love story. To know my life is a story is to know that the story must be performed. There are three levels of relationship to performance, and particularly to the performance of our story. Level one, pre-tragic performance. Level two is when we meet the tragic and stop performing. And level three is the post-tragic, in which we reclaim both the dignity and the divinity of our performance. And with that, I turn my word back to you, Dr. Marc.
So let's go to David's code, okay? I want to go back to David's code here that he read. And I want to go to the second part of the code. What I would like, with everyone's permission, is I want to spend the next 3-4 weeks kind of deep in this story, right? Conversation. So the code reads, the universe is not a fact, and maybe we could read it together wherever we are. The universe is not a fact. It's in the chat box, if you can see it there. The universe is not a fact, it's a story. It's not an ordinary story, but a love story. It's not an ordinary love story, but an evolutionary love story, right? An outrageous love story. And your story, my story, is chapter and verse in the universe : a love story. Okay, good. So that's good. Let me just add perhaps one thing here. Let me take a look. You know, what we send out this week. Right? So we sent out this week, you know, and maybe we could kind of, you know, read it together. I'll read it to you. We said this week, there's a famous, you know, American poet, right, that says reality is not made up of atoms, reality is made up of stories, right? But actually, our response to that poet, to Muriel, is actually atoms themselves are stories, right? The very structure of an atom is a story. It's a particular story of allurement. It's a story of reaching for value. And we said that this Sunday, we're going to explore stories in the world of matter, atoms, right? We're going to explore stories in the world of life, and we're going to explore stories in the world of the self-reflective human. And we're going to talk about the evolution of story. So we're going to do that next week. We're going to get there. And I want to stay really close in this story idea. What I'd like to start with this week, though, is one dimension, which is, and in some sense, we're going to reverse the order, if that's okay, which is, once you realize that reality is a story, and we're going to go deep into that next week, this realization that reality is a story at its core structure, that everything is a story, I call it the ontology of story, right? The lineage would call it God loves stories, right? But in other words, that reality is structurally a story all the way down and all the way up the evolutionary chain. That story is not merely a story, right? It's not a human contrivance. That story is the essential structure of reality itself, right? And language is the ritual of storytelling. That's what language is. Language allows us to tell stories. That's what language does. Language takes sound and turns them into meaning because meaning is already there, right? Language is this self-organizing code, right? Right, the self-organizing code, Lena, we said in a conversation once, I think a couple of weeks ago, which tells stories. But I want to talk not about that this week. I want to talk about, as we start one mountain, and we're going to be short now, but I want to see if we can get that. Okay. We'll see if we want to get that. Okay. I don't want to go into story now, and I don't want to go into language. I'm going to go into one dimension, which is that if you understand that your life is a story, okay, if you understand that your life is a story, you realize that you have to perform the story, that you're an actor on the stage. Okay. And for you Shakespeareans, I actually didn't have a chance to, I don't remember in this moment for some reason, I don't know, it exited my mind. So maybe someone will fill it in for me, where Shakespeare says all the world's a stage, and if that's exactly what he said or what he meant when he said it. So I'm not going to cite that because who knows what he was saying? I don't remember. But all the world is a stage, right? But and what we mean by that is that the world is a story, and my life's a story, and a story has to be performed. So I want to, if you can, we can just kind of open our hearts. I want to go deep into this for a second, because performance is unbelievably important, and we've lost our capacity to perform. And we can only respond to the meta crisis with what I would call a performance of our humanity. We have to perform our story. This is now part 3 today. We have to perform our story. We have to perform our humanity. We have to perform evolution. We have to perform our sexing, right? We have to perform our sacred autobiography. So let me see if we can kind of capture this, okay? See if I can capture this, right? And it's gorgeous. So there's a level of pre-tragic humanity, okay, in which there's an automatic understanding of the need to perform. And that understanding actually begins even in the animal world, right? Animals have mating rituals, right? The Brower bird does an incredible dance. And then, the animal sexes. The sexing itself in the animal world is generally short, a few seconds, but there's a performance that often leads up to the allurement and the mating ritual. This notion of ritual, though, takes a momentous leap forward in the human world. And as we enter into the human world, the need for ritual in its performance becomes central to the human experience. And there are those who date the emergence of Homo sapien with the emergence of trade. Matt Ridley talks about that quite extensively, citing many anthropologists. But there's another anthropological school, which I think is in part more accurate, although they're obviously, mutually supportive in certain ways, which actually dates the emergence of humanity with both language and art. Right? Language and art, or performed rituals, right? Artistically performed rituals, moving from paintings to religious rituals. Now you have the beginnings, you have proto experiences of, stay close, friends. You have proto experiences of religion in the animal world. The animal world already has proto experiences, early experiences of awe. And that's in the literature, of animal research in the last 15 years is disclosing this, but actually already in the lineage I mentioned last week, there's a book called the Book of Song, Perek Shira, which talks about the unique verse, right, of awe expressed by every animal. But it becomes central and apparent, right? And it takes this momentous leap forward in some way in the human world. There's some emergence in the human world that's very dramatic, in which we perform. And we perform at the pre-tragic level. Everyone with me? And at the pre-tragic level, we perform. When I say it's pre-tragic, the pre-tragic level means everything's obvious and clear. So we perform. Why do we perform? Because there's gods and goddesses. Does everyone get that? There's gods and goddesses, right? The hills are alive with the sound of music. If we can jump forward, to a song and the sound of music in the mid 20th century. But it's the hills are alive with the sound of music is the experience of the pre-tragic world. The hills are alive. I do believe in fairies. I do. Right? The Celtic sensibility of a kind of living universe is self-evident across the traditions, right? Everything's alive. There's a coherent field, and there's this interaction and relationship, however that relationship works between the human world and the broader field. And so we perform, right? The stage is obvious, and maybe we're performing for the gods and goddesses. Maybe we're performing for the one God. That's not our conversation now. But performance makes sense. Ritual makes sense. And I'm not performing to be inauthentic. Does everyone get that? Right? I'm not performing to be inauthentic. I'm performing to make contact, to connect with the wider field, right? Whether it's to propitiate the deity, to ask favor, whether it's to locate myself in the wider field, right? Whether it's to feel the eros of the wider field, whether it's to give praise, whether it's to offer sacrifice, right? I'm performing. I'm in ritual, right? I understand performance. It's a natural place to be. I make contact with the wider field through my performance. Then what happens is, at some point, as we go through, right, all the stages of human development, we get to the modern world and the postmodern world, in which the world becomes disenchanted. We forget that the hills are alive. The world gets reduced to a kind of materialism. Descartes can no longer hear the sound of music living in the animal. But more than that, we have a kind of dualism, from the 17th century to the 19th century, which says, yeah, God's over there someplace, but the universe is purely material. And God might enter and act in the world, suggested the dualists. Then 2 centuries later in the 19th century, the materialists said, yeah, the dualists got one half right, the material part, and the God thing they were making up. So they lopped off the top half of the circle. So you have a circle where the top is God and the bottom is material. That was dualism. The materialists of the 19th century followed the dualists of the 17th century. They lopped off the top half of the circle, and they said, we live in flatland. Does everyone get that? We live in flatland. It's a flat world. It's a world ultimately without depth, right? Without the depth and dimension, right, that you would need, right, to actually access, right, the hills being alive with the sound of music. That's the tragic level. And at that tragic level, what we say is stop performing. Does everyone get that? The word performance itself becomes almost pejorative. Does everyone get what I'm saying? Well, like, why are you performing? Just get real, right? Just stop performing. And just be authentic. But authentic means why you're performing, because there's nothing to perform. I mean, there's no one to perform for. There's nothing that you're actually eliciting, right? So you're actually posturing, right? And you're posturing, and the word posture and imposture are etymologically related, right? There's and there's certainly, I didn't look up the etymology. That's a guess, but we'll have to look up the etymology. But imposture and posturing, my guess is that they're etymologically related, but they're certainly associated in their inner meaning, right? The impostor postures. Does everyone get that? The impostor postures. So what are you doing? Right. And Lane, that's exactly right. Just, stop it. Just get real. Right. And there was an entire movement, right, both in philosophy, right, in art, which said just get spare and simple. Right. There's nothing out there. Right. Just stop it. Stop the performance. And that's tragic, right? There's this tragic moment. There's nothing to perform, right? Don't perform your sexuality, just have sex, right? Don't perform your life, just live your life, right? And on the one hand, there's a rejection of the inauthentic artifice of performance, which is positive. But on the other hand, there's a rejection that there's anything to perform at all. Does everyone get that? That's the tragic level, which rejects performance. There's nothing to perform. And then we go to the post-tragic and we reclaim performance. We reclaim performance. In other words, I begin to realize, oh, there is a field of Eros value, right? There is, right, a cosmos that's a living universe. There is a second person, right? Actually, right, there's an infinite intimate in which everything arises, right? And the field of the divine is not merely the infinity of power, as we've said many times, but the infinity of intimacy. So there's a second person relation. And there's this, how we started today, there's this first person that dances in me that wants to emerge. And as we said today, I've got to cultivate the emergence of first person. And it's not obvious. I need to disambiguate between the authentic God voice and the inauthentic God voice. And I've got to perform my prophecy, and I've got to learn my lines, right? There's actually lines in the universe. There's actually a script that's mine. I'm actually a unique letter, a unique script in the cosmic scroll, and there's lines that are left by eternity for me to read and for me to evolve. And those lines are both already a given and they're emerging, right? And they're contingent, right? And they're radically surprising. But the kind of the general invitation of my life and its scripts was intended by reality. And reality intended me, and reality chose me to play that part. And reality recognizes me as the primary actor in that dimension of cosmos. And reality needs my script. And reality desires my performance. And reality love adores my performance. Right? So there's something to perform. In the post-tragic, we recognize that in the field of Eros value, right, we are actually the storytellers. There's actually a story here. There's a story to be told. Reality is not merely a fact to be described mechanically. Reality is filled with the sound of music, and it's the music, it's the melody of story. And story has to be performed. Story is art. And we go to movies because we're in love with story, right? I have to perform my sacred autobiography, right? And I begin, for example, take sexing. I begin to realize that sexing is not a mechanical act in the world of the tragic, but sexing is cosmic Eros performed in the flesh. Does everyone get that? Sexing is cosmic Eros performed in the flesh, right? And when I'm engaged in sexing, or when I'm engaged in realizing that evolution moves in me in person, right? Conscious evolution, the realization that I am the performance of evolution. That's what conscious evolution means. Conscious evolution means that I awaken to the realization that the evolutionary impulse moves uniquely in me. And I both realize that that evolutionary impulse moves in my first person, but I'm also able to kind of watch and see, oh, that's me performing. So when the witness to my performance, second person, and my performance, first person, merge into one, that's the greatest performance, right? In other words, when the musician becomes the music, that's the ultimate performance, right? When the artist loses himself or herself, right? And she begins to paint through her or him, or to write through her or him, or to sex through her or him, or to talk through her or him, or to organize majestically, right? You know, and artistically, right? The Vishnu function in Hindu mysticism, to organize, to weave the strands together, right? And she's moving through me, right? And when my witness and my first person synergizes one, that's the ultimate performance. You know, I went to, with Christina, we took Zion. You know, it was a father-son trip, but KK came with us and took care of us, right? So it was this trip, right? You know, and we went to Circus Olay, to the circus, And for some reason, I think I got nauseous, or KK got nauseous, or Zion did. I don't know exactly what happened, but somehow we had these cheap seats, right? And somehow we wound up like just about in the first row, and kind of we were in the mezzanine. Then we wound up kind of in the like right next to the stage, and it was this. We were like for 1 hour, the last hour, we were riveted, right? You've got this group of kids. I mean, they must have been 18, 19, 20, 25, and they're performing. They're performing their bodies, right? They're performing motion itself. They're performing movement. They're performing, right, the musical play. They're performing, right, the synchronies of coordination that are shocking and dazzling, right, in their beauty. And as they performed, they became more themselves than they ever were. It wasn't a performance that was inauthentic. It was a performance that disclosed, right, their ultimate realization in first person, right? It potentiated, performance potentiated, right, or realized the potentiation of their fullness. That's what practice is, right? And it's I perform in order to become myself, right? So I don't just make love personally, right? Because part of the realization of the story is, when I perform the story, part of the realization is that my story is not separate from the universe, a love story. So there's no split in the story between the personal and the cosmic. Right, Danette? And until I realize that every detail of my story, right, is until I realize there's no detail of my story that's disconnected from cosmic magnificence, my mind can never feel any sense of ease, right? Until the story of my life is told. Laura Riding wrote this next line: until the story of my life is told, I will go on quietly craving it. But Laura Riding just got a piece of it. No, until the story of my life is told, and I realize that my story is part of the story of cosmos. The cosmos is a story, and I'm a chapter in that story, and I'm a necessary, right, chapter in my story. We talk a lot about, kind of the meaning of life, right? So we should talk less about the meaning of life, right? Right? There is, in a certain sense, it's not that life, right? We search for the meaning of life. You don't have to search for the meaning of life, right? You don't have to search for the meaning of life, because life is meaning. Life is meaning. And meaning always discloses itself in story, right? A value is a desire I have for realization, right, in the course of a story. So the universe is story. The universe is semantic, right? And the universe is made up of stories, and stories have grammar. So there's a story of value, and the story has a grammar of value, right? And our chromosomes themselves are tomes, right? Right? Our atoms are already, right, encyclopedias, right? But they're not just encyclopedias of facts. They're great encyclopedias, which are great biographies telling stories of movements of allurement, right? Moving towards ever deeper contact and ever larger wholes, right? So it's not that we have to search for meaning. Do you get that? There's no search for meaning. There's nothing to search for. We are meaning, right? We articulate meaning in every breath, right? And all of our stories, right, have plot lines, right? And our story, our individual story, our individual saga, right, is not separate or distinct from, right, the magnificent and sprawling saga of the universe. Right? And all of it is performed. Does everyone get that? So to know that my life is a story is to know, we'll go back to the code, to know that the story must be performed. And there's 3 levels of relationship to performance, right? Right? And particularly to the performance of our story. Level 1 is pre-tragic performance. It's clear, we perform. We're in some version of pre-modern performance in our tradition. Gorgeous, right? It's fantastic. And then we get to this tragic place of postmodernity where we stop performing. And we actually view performance becomes a pejorative word. It becomes identical with the inauthentic, with the not real. And then we go to the post-tragic and we realize, no, we perform to elicit the real. At Circus LA, they were performing to elicit the real, right? When we do ritual, when we do ritual practice, we do enlightenment practice. We perform to elicit the real. Right? When I perform, when I'm reading my lines, and they're the lines of my unique sacred autobiography that can only be spoken by me, that all of reality and all of eternity and all of evolution waited for me to speak, right? Then I become me. And I become me because I now become, right, the primary actor in the story. So we realize reality is a story, number one. Number two, we realize that it's not an ordinary story, it's a love story. It's a story of Eros, it's a story of allurement. Number three, we realize that our stories, our personal stories, are chapter and verse in this great story. Number four, we realize we're the storytellers of the whole story. That's what conscious evolution means. We're not just the storytellers of our story, we have to be the storytellers of the whole story. Conscious evolution means two things. One, we begin to see the storyline. We begin to see the storyline. We begin to see, oh, wow, right? There's a movement from matter to life to mind, and there's a plot line, right? There's a set of first principles and first values that are emerging and developing in this large, there's discontinuities, but there's also this long continuities, right? This evolution of these first principles and first values through matter, life, and mind. That's the first part of conscious evolution. I realize there's a story. Does everyone get that? We didn't say that before. I realize there's a story. I see the sweep of the universe story. And then part five, so I become the storyteller of the universe. That's four. Part five, I realize my story, right? You're right. I'm an actor in the story. My story, I'm an actor in the story. 5, 6. And that my story is a chapter in this larger story. There's no split between the personal and the cosmic, right? In early feminism, they said the personal is the political. We now realize, no, the personal is the polis of the cosmos. The personal is the cosmic, right? Number 6 and number 7, we realize that the entire story is unfinished. It's an unfinished story. And then I participate in telling, in taking the story forward and evolving the story. It's not just that my story is part of my, as unique self, my story is a unique chapter in the story, but number 7, my story evolves the story. It's an unfinished story, and my story evolves the story. Right? Wow. And finally, number 8, last one. When we meet someone and we have this, profound new relationship with them, which is unusual, and we say, wow, we always knew each other. Right? That rare moment, we say those rare meetings, well, we always knew each other. And we realize that we're each holding a piece of each other's story. Right? In a genuine, unique self-encounter, we each realize we're each holding a piece of each other's story, and we can only complete each other's story with each other. Right? We need each other. Right? No one's holding the whole story. Our stories evoke each other. We each evoke each other's story, but more than that, right? We each have a piece of each other's story that we can return to that person. In a genuine, but a real unique self-encounter, I realize you have a piece of my story that you're returning to me. And by you living your story, these are two distinct points. I can live my story. We create the possibility of each living our unique stories that are inter-included and overlapping. 1, 2, we evoke each other's story. Right? When you're living your story, you evoke my story. Your authenticity evokes my authenticity. Your performance of your story evokes my performance of my story. And then 3, in this last point, there's 3 points in 8. 3 is you're actually holding a piece of my story that you can return to me. Right? You recognize a piece of my story in a way I don't. And you're holding that piece for me and you return it to me. That's what it means to love each other madly. Okay, wow. Right? Wow. Wow. So let's perform our stories. We have to perform our authenticity. Right? I mean, let me end with something silly. Right? Put on a nice shirt, even when you're at home by yourself. Right? Whatever that means to you. Maybe that's not the way you perform. But however you perform, you've got to always be doing ritual. You can't just say it. You can't just think it. You have to perform it. Right? I perform my unique self. Right? I perform my unique story. It's dramatic. Right? Chogyam Trungpa, who founded Naropa, an Eastern master and a particular lineage who founded Naropa University, he was, he spent, he was a wildly realized master, was always also kind of drunk most of the time, and pretty much slept with every student in Europa. It was the early 70s and crazy stuff was happening. And so he was both a realized master and in this space between generations, which was a different space. It wasn't the space of today, right? So he was a kind of a crazy wisdom master, right? Not to be imitated, right? In any way, to be clear. But he would always perform. So literally all the time, he would have, he would always literally, they would, he'd be the captain or he'd be the general or he'd be the king, and people would have positions in the court and they'd perform all the time. Right. And people were like, what is he doing? And still today, they think, what crazy thing was he doing? Right. But actually, from his heart to my heart, right. It's like from my heart to your heart, our hearts together, we perform. One mountain has to be a performance, but not inauthentic. Right. And in other words, right, all great art is performance, and life is great art. Right. Life's great art, and it requires performance. Right. We're always on. Right. We're always on. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. Even when we're relaxing, we're totally spatially relaxing. We're actually, right, we're witnessed. Right. Our story is fabricating, right, the world story.